minute.
Time, wow.
I think we may have some weather delays here with Peggy and Mark, perhaps. Oh, there's Mark. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'd like to welcome you all and wish you a good morning. On behalf of the League of Women Voters of Bloomington, Monroe County, and the Greater Bloomington Chamber of Commerce, I want to welcome you to the first session of the 2020 series of legislative updates. My name is Ann Birch, and I will be moderating this session. I would also like to introduce the representatives from the Chamber, who are Mary Morgan, she's there in the back of the room, and Thomas Curry. This morning, our local legislators will report on their work and priorities for the current session of the Indiana General Assembly. They will each have up to 10 minutes. After that, we will welcome questions from the audience. If you wish to ask a question, please limit your question to 1 minute. Our timers, in the front row here, will show the remaining time for each question. You should have received a yellow sheet and a white sheet when you came in. The yellow sheet has instructions and also space for formulating your question, so you can be sure to fit whatever you have into 1 minute. If a questioner has more than one question, persons who have not asked a question will be given preference. So if there's still time, then you can ask more than one question in turn. The white sheet that you were given lists government leadership and legislators for Monroe County. The back side of this sheet gives tips on how to contact these individuals. This morning is intended as an informative session, an opportunity to get information from our legislators. It is not intended as a time to make public statements or to engage in debate. Please frame your questions to elicit information for the benefit of everyone here and to enable any of the legislators to weigh in. You may agree or disagree with the legislators' comments, but we ask you to be respectful. We also ask that you hold your applause until the end of this session, and please silence your electronic devices. With us this morning, we have Representative Jeff Ellington. He represents the 62nd District. And we have Representative Matt Pierce representing the 61st District. Peggy Mayfield hasn't made it in yet. She could be a little bit snow-blocked, so we hope she'll make it in later. She represents the 60th District. And then Senator Mark Stoops representing the 40th Senate District. Representative Ellington, would you like to get us started with your summary?
Yes, thank you. So I'm Jeff Ellington, represent District 62. So if you can compass what that district consists of, I go from southwest Bloomington through Van Buren over to Greene County. I take in 90% of Greene County all the way up to Worthington, over to Linton, and I drop down to Daviess County. I go and take in the town of Odin, and then I go east into Martin County, and I'm on the top side of Lagodi and Shoals. Crane is in my district, and by the way, Crane is the third largest employer in southwest Indiana, which is really an important asset, not only for my district, but for Indiana. And I think, and my wife tells me to be really careful how I say this, because I think in Indiana, based upon our national interest, I have one of the most important districts in the nation because of Crane. You know, and there's a lot of help we get from IU and Purdue in that initiative. I've been up in the House. This is my fifth session. As you know, I'm a retired firefighter, 28 years here at the City of Bloomington. I was privileged to have that honor to serve and to defend and help with my public safety aspect. Also, I've had a tree and land clearing company for about 40 years, ever since high school. And I own a small demolition company, and we do what they call green demolition, which we really look at green initiatives for trying to save products and reuse. I also sit on the House on Natural Resource Committee. I sit on financial institutions and also local gov. While I've been in the State House, I've been able to pass some legislation that's not only goes dealing with synthetic opiates that have been and are still being shipped into the U.S. from China and other black markets. We was able to pass my legislation in 2016 for that. I've also dealt with, in the Financial Institution Committee, dealing with legislation that would help prevent and stop fraud, especially dealing with the lapse times of the statute of limitations for certain crimes. So that legislation, what that did was, if you've been defrauded in the past and it takes many years for you to figure that out, or for the prosecutor to get the evidence, that statute of limitations times will start on the day that the prosecutor finds enough evidence. So even though the crime may lapse after 5 years, 3 or 4 years later after that lapse, you can still pick that up. We've also done some legislation with our parks to make them more efficient and make an investment in infrastructure. And we've worked also with the Democrat side of the House to accomplish a lot of those goals. Last session, I was able to do a telemarketer robocall bill, which would make and double penalties for those that are breaking the law, not only nationally but in our state. So we've been able to accomplish a lot together. We put together a 20-year road funding bill that is the only state in the nation that has a 20-year fully funded road plan. But we've also made some investment in educational dollars by paying off the pension liabilities of school corporations across Indiana, which is an ongoing, I believe, about a $70 million a year savings each year. We've put items on the docket for this session, and I've got 200 and some pages here that talks about all the things and different things of the bill, so I'll just go through a few short ones. HB 1001, it passed out of the House and holds teachers and schools harmless for iLearn. Those test results. Concerning testing, it cost about $28 million to test for schools across Indiana, but we have to do that because it's federally mandated, and we spend $28 million to gain $1 billion in federal funding. So if we do not do the testing, we lose $1 billion. We also passed HB 1002, which decoupled teacher performance evaluations from student test scores, and we put that back at a local school board level, so that'll be a local decision. We provided in HB 1003 flexibility in teacher training and license requirements, which streamlines that process a little better. We also get in, and we're still working on surprise billing for healthcare providers, and this doesn't concern emergency type things that you'd have to be provided for, but what it does for scheduled procedures that you may have to do. It will guarantee at least a price structure for that. And that's a focus not only here in our state, but nationwide. There was a study of 25 states that talked about and looked into healthcare costs that were provided by nonprofit hospitals, et cetera. It found that Indiana is 300 and some percent over the Medicaid price structure, when the average of some of the states was a little, give or take, 4%. And Indiana, out of that 25, was the top percentage for profits, over $1.7 or $1.8 billion in profit per year for nonprofits. So that's something we think is important to look at. So there's a whole lot of lists. I'll let the other representatives speak about the issues, but I appreciate being up here for you and giving me an opportunity to serve you. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Pierce?
Thank you. Well, the legislature got off to a very fast start. It's normally a very compressed process in a short session anyway, but this year, for some reason, to me, it seems a lot more crammed in on the front end. There's really just about 2 weeks for any bill to get out of the first house. So the deadline for bills to be out of House committees is Tuesday. So we're pretty much done. Any House bill that got introduced that doesn't move by Tuesday, it's pretty much over for that bill. So it's come in really fast. So, and then the week after that, we'll be into the deadline for bills to pass the House. So it's a very fast process. And because of that, really, even in the first couple of days of the session, you could really see the differences between the two parties, the philosophical differences and the priorities. And I want to really illustrate that, I want to talk about this extra $300 million that appeared, right? So you might know that $300 million more dollars came in the last budget year than was anticipated by the forecast. So some people have described that as kind of a one-time money or one-time windfall. But what I point out to people is that, you know, these economists, they make estimates, they basically guess scientifically what they think will come in. And had they been accurate in their forecast and that $300 million had been predicted to come in, no one would call it one-time money. It would just be your revenue stream. So the reason why that matters is if you really believe it's one-time money, then you can make an argument that you should only spend it on one-time things and not build it into the base. But I think that the fact that if it had been forecast properly, no one would say it's one time. And then the other thing is the forecast now for the next year or two is showing revenues running ahead of what the budget was based on. So we have theoretically even more money coming in. So the question then becomes, what do you do with that money? Well, the Republicans decided that what they would do is use that money to pay cash for a bunch of university projects instead of going through with bonding. So in the budget, they approved bonds to be let. Now, as you know, interest rates are very low. The state leaders are very proud of talking about how we have this great bond rating, which gives us access to the cheapest money that's out there. And so for the Democrats, the question became, do you take that $300 million and invest it in people, or do you invest it in buildings? And so we, when that bill came to the floor, we offered some alternatives that were voted on and voted down. So we said instead of doing the one-time payment on the buildings, let's just continue with the bonding plan on those, and let's take that money, and first offer was, let's just deal with teacher pay right now. Right? Let's not, the governor's got plans, there's a committee that's going to give us plans, but it's all about wait till next year. We said, let's just deal with it now and get something going on teacher pay. That was rejected. Then we said, how about early childhood education? All right, it's technically expanded to the entire state now, but it's not funded for people in the entire state to have it. And of course, every year that goes by where a child misses a year of early childhood education is a year you don't get back. So we said, why don't we do that? And the answer was, oh, we have to wait till the budget year to do any of this stuff. And then you get to the budget year and you're told there's no money. So we're in this constant loop. And the other point I would make about that too, so the advocates of just spending the cash for the buildings instead of the bonding say, well, we're going to save like $100 million. So why wouldn't you do that? Why wouldn't you be fiscally responsible? And I want you to know that there's a lot of contention around that $100 million figure and how it's calculated, because you have to make some assumptions about interest rates. I don't think they're talking about, you know, how the money the value of the money declines over time because of inflation. And so my understanding was that in the Ways and Means Committee, there's a bit of discussion about, like, what is the real savings here? And there were some requests of the administration to provide, you know, the real calculations behind their estimates, and they were not willing to provide that. So I think that there's just an issue out there. Finally, I would just say on that philosophy, because this really is interesting, because, you know, if Democrats suggest we actually spend money on people, we're usually called fiscally irresponsible. And then we're told how the other side does such a good job of managing all this money. And to me, it would be like, I said this at the chamber meeting, to me it'd be like if you were renting an apartment and you suddenly came into an inheritance, or you got a big pay raise or something, and you could go out and buy a house for cash. Well, certainly that would be great, and you wouldn't have a mortgage, and you would normally say do that. But if you're sitting in a nice house that you've paid cash for, but now you have no money in the bank to pay for your kid's education, was that the best decision? And I think that's kind of the situation that the state found in. We could have invested that money now in some people that would provide us some real benefit in the future. So we're kind of like sitting in our paid-for house, but now we have no money for the kids' education. Okay, so that was a big issue. Some other kind of real differences between the parties. So we had an amendment we offered that would create a system of paid family and medical leave in the state of Indiana. And when this has been brought up in the past, people said, well, you can't simply mandate that an employer give someone paid family leave because they won't be able to afford it. It'll be difficult on them. So we took that concern to heart, and we put forth a proposal. It's been adopted in some other states that essentially creates a program similar to unemployment insurance or workers' compensation, where both the employers and the employees would participate in contributing to a fund that would be used to pay for people when they have to go on paid family and medical leave. And it would be, I mean, you're talking like a couple bucks a week or something. It's a pretty small amount that would be matched, but you'd basically have this fund and it would work like unemployment insurance. So the entire burden would not be on the employer to fund that. You would have a kind of a collective insurance program. And we offered that amendment and it was voted down. Another issue that came up was tax exemptions on sales tax. So there's a bill moving that will exempt the sale of recreational vehicles that are sold in Indiana and then I guess moved out of state. And I think it's a little less than a couple $1 million that it would cost the state to do that. So an amendment was offered that would say, okay, while we're exempting the recreational vehicles, how about we exempt from sales tax things related to breastfeeding, breast pumps, and things that women need to ensure that they can breastfeed their kids. And we were kind of told, well, gee, that's going to cost a lot. About $1.7 million. So again, tax break for RVs, sure. Tax breaks for mothers breastfeeding their kids, no thanks, can't afford it. I mean, this kind of stuff is really frustrating me. I've been watching this go on for at least a decade now. And I think that something's got to change on that. Okay, the good news is, give you some good news, that Representative Ellington mentioned, is the bill has passed that will decouple test results from teacher pay. And that's a really big thing, and I applaud the Republicans for being willing to reverse their policy they put in place 10 years ago. It's interesting how no one wants to figure out, everyone acts like they can't quite figure out how that policy got into the law, but it did. So that's the good news. So we're kind of dialing back to high-stakes testing a bit. And we got a lot more work to do in the area of education policy, but that is a good move, and I appreciate it. Okay, the final thing I'll talk about, because I'm probably using up a lot of time here, is the coal companies are at work at the State House. You may have read about this, but there's a bill that was voted out of committee that will essentially require any utility that wants to retire a coal plant to have to go to the Utility Commission to get permission. In fact, the bill is written in a way that it says that one particular coal plant, you have to give 3 years notice before you shut it down. And this is really kind of plowing new ground. You might remember Scott Pruitt, who is Donald Trump's EPA administrator, who had to leave Washington under an ethical cloud. He's now registered as a coal lobbyist and is working in Indiana, but we never see him in the State House. He's like out there somewhere roaming the streets of Indianapolis, working on things. So it's really going to be fascinating to see what happens to this bill as it moves along, because we had a very long committee hearing on it in the Utilities Committee. About 34, 35 people testified. 4 people in favor of the bill were all from the Indiana Coal Council or hired by them. And then the other 30 people opposed the bill, including the Indiana State Chamber of Commerce, the utilities, the Indiana Energy Association. So we're in this very odd situation where all of the environmentalists and consumer groups are aligned with the utilities and their trade associations to try to stop this bill that essentially attempts to freeze in place a failing industry that can no longer compete. I mean, these utilities are not really making these decisions because they're lying awake at night worrying about climate change. They're making these decisions because natural gas is so much cheaper, and these coal plants are old and aging, and you're constantly fighting these environmental problems with the coal plants. And so they're just decided to get out of it. And so they're shutting these things down. They want to be out of coal probably like within a decade, some faster than that. So the coal industry has donated to a lot of campaigns, and I think they're calling in their investments now. We're going to see how that works out.
Thank you.
Representative Mayfield, would you like to take a few minutes? Sure. Senator Stoops.
All right, thank you. I would agree that short session, so bills have to move quickly to get heard by committee and then passed in the various chambers. Right now, the Senate deadline for committee reports is next Thursday, so any bill that's going to move forward needs to be passed out of committee by next Thursday, and then the week after will be the final opportunity for the different bills before they transfer houses. And it's kind of interesting to hear the House side, different things that are going through. On the Senate side, many of the most controversial bills, they like to hold till the final weeks. So we expect to be hearing those come before committee and get out of committee over the next couple weeks. So what I want to do, because I always feel bad when I come here and just give you all bad news, but there are definitely some bills out there that hopefully we'll cover today, and I'll try to bring them up. Teacher pay, some other issues, but I want to tell you about some good things that are happening. So over the summer, we were trying to get a handle on the high cost of health care in Indiana. People in Indiana pay the highest rates for hospital care. They pay some of the highest rates for pharmaceuticals. And the reason is that there are some loopholes out there. So we have bills moving that say, for instance, that if you can actually check how much different hospitals charge for different procedures. So there's a transparency issue there. There's also a bill that would say a hospital cannot charge you for out-of-network cost. So if you're in the middle of an operation and they pull in somebody that's out of your network and suddenly you get a bill for $10,000, that's a shock. And this would make that not allowed. So that's going to be important. We also heard testimony about pharmaceutical benefit managers. Now this is a fun one. So it turns out that out of all the regulations for insurance companies and healthcare providers, there's a loophole. And for instance, Anthem has set up their own pharmaceutical benefits manager. CVS Caremark, one of the largest in the country, so you've got some really big players. And so if your company has a health plan, pharmaceutical benefit manager decides what drugs you can get and how much they're reimbursed for. But then they get to charge for it, so they get kickbacks. So for instance, if your doctor writes a prescription for a drug and the pharmaceutical manager decides that they don't make enough profit on that drug, but they have another option that they have a better margin on, they will say that, no, you have to get prescribed this other medication. Not only that, they get a kickback. They also get a kickback from the pharmaceutical manufacturers. They tend to own the pharmacies. So sometimes if you don't even have insurance and you go to CVS, you can get a drug cheaper than you would if you were covered. It's kind of a crazy system. Again, there's loopholes in the laws that allow this. It explains sometimes you're looking at 20, 30, 40% markup on these pharmaceuticals. And really it hurts, like for instance, we have local pharmacies, your smaller local pharmacies are kind of at the behest of these large players because they then are not allowed to do this. So anyway, there's bills addressing that. I've had some good results on a regional transportation expansion bill. This year, I have Senator Alting as first author on this bill. Senator Alting from Lafayette. Lafayette's had a problem. They were promised $3 million to be able to extend trains down to Tippecanoe County. Again, promised by the state of Indiana, and then it was not included in the budget. So like many local governments, they need options to expand transit options. And this bill would provide that opportunity to create another revenue source. So Senator Holcomb, which is a chair of Tax and Fiscal, is on the bill. I have Ron Grooms, who represents Clarksville in the Southern District. They get their transportation from Kentucky, but they only have a couple of routes. So what they'd really like to do is be able to expand those routes and connect to those routes. So I have senators from that represent Anderson and Muncie. So Anderson and Muncie are trying to make a connected transit route between those two communities. And again, they need another revenue source to be able to do that. It's supported by the Chamber of Commerce, and it's even supported by our local Chamber of Commerce. Obviously, it's supported by the AARP. They are very strong supporters of this, as are the disability service providers, because if you have a disability or you're a senior, you don't have a license, you can't get to your work. But also it's a real economic development tool, because many areas, like Bloomington, half of our population lives outside of the city's jurisdiction. The city has a transportation network, but they can't go into the county because the county hasn't provided any funding towards it. As well, all these counties have rural transit. So rural transit is a key player in being able to set up interconnected networks between the counties, even if they don't have a transit system in their local municipality. Also, we have a number of environmental issues that seem to be working towards progress. And one of those is a state forest commission, which would have an in-depth look at how we manage our state forests, how the logging affects it, maybe some different management practices like long-term preservation. I have a carbon sequestration bill that's gotten a lot of support. I have Senator Glick, who's the chair of Natural Resources, on the bill, and also Gene Lysine, who's the chair of Ag. Now, what this bill proposes is that we have many industries that want to become carbon neutral. You may have heard that Microsoft wants to be carbon negative. And part of their ability to do that is to invest in forest, for instance, permanently preserved forest, but also ag practices that it's called carbon farming or soil health, where the farmers are actually implementing practices to get the carbon back into the soil where it's trapped. And we have a Benjamin Harrison Trust Fund in Indiana that's used by a lot of land trusts. It's used by the DNR for purchases. And so this would ask for a summer study committee to come up with a method that industries could contribute to the Benjamin Harrison Trust Fund. Purdue could come up with whatever carbon offset a certain forest value, and then that company could use that to achieve their carbon offset goals. Toyota, for instance, has a huge budget just for reducing their carbon footprint. This could also be used with funds under the Clean Water Act. So, for instance, the Department of Ag is very interested in this bill. So it looks like it's got a lot of support. Hopefully it'll be moving forward. I haven't looked at the clock. I don't know how long I've got. So we have vaping is a real problem. So the federal government is unusually beat us to it by raising the age to 21 for both cigarettes and vaping. You cannot buy cigarettes if you're under 21. You cannot buy vaping products. We had discussion about, well, people can choose what's wrong with cigarettes. I don't know that cigarettes is the big issue anymore. I think people know about cigarettes and the price of them, but vaping is an epidemic. So I don't know if you know or if you have kids in school. There are kids, and I've talked to a woman who runs our tobacco cessation program here last week who's so concerned. She has kids that they're trying to wean off nicotine in the 5th and 6th grades. So the problem is these vaping companies are using the same strategies that tobacco companies used to use. They would focus on kids, knowing that kids grow up, they're consumers. You get them addicted, it's just like any drug dealer. You get them addicted and they're going to come back to you. Make it easy. So in Case for Children, they make these fruit flavors, all these very sweet flavors. It's very easy. There's no smoke. These kids, and it's not like a cigarette where you got to go off behind the back wall or you've got to hide. They're vaping in the classroom. They're vaping under their desk. They're vaping in the restroom. But they have so much access to it. And nicotine is such a highly addictive substance. Nicotine is one of the most addictive substances. And these kids are getting addicted at just a super young age. So we're not even talking about middle school and high school. But obviously, by the time we get there, a lot of use in middle and high school. So we're getting kids now, and it's a public health threat. You talk about why do we want to limit this? Because even if you're just looking at the cost, it's a huge public health cost moving into the future. So anyway, hopefully there'll be time to talk about some more. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Peggy Mayfield, she represents the 60th District. Would you like to give your summary?
I won't take as much because they've covered so much of what I had already planned on talking about. I'm assuming that Representative Ellington, you've also talked about the House bills on education and so forth. So the Senate also has similar bills on these education issues. They might be slightly different. So a lot of times, we'll find out at the end, they might think a little differently than the House Republicans do about how to fix these. So we'll hash that out. We've often joked that sometimes it isn't Republican versus Democrat on these ideas. Sometimes it's House versus Senate on these ideas. So we'll see what comes over from the Senate at the turn of the session here in about a week. Just a different take, a different viewpoint on some of the points as I walked in and Representative Pierce was talking about that $130 million. I'm not saying he's wrong and I'm right. I'm just saying these are other considerations that we take under advisement is when you come to that calculation, and we say the semi-scientific way of calculating it, in general, we've been accurate within about 2%. So we're working on a budget calculation that was done last year, and so far it's been accurate. We have unforeseen revenue, but we also have to think, once we commit money to the budget, in the structure of the budget, it is there forever. And you will keep building on what's there forever. So before we do that, and it may be that we do that, we want to make sure that that's a consistent source and not just a fluke. It might be a fluke, it might not. So before we make that commitment, we want to make sure that we can count on that so that next year when we have to cut back because those revenues aren't there, they're not coming back and saying, well, you cut our funding. So if we offer it, we want to make sure we can always offer it. The RV tax is an unusual bill. It has been around for a while. Last year, the exact bill passed the House, got into the Senate, and at the last minute, they took it out. So it at least has had 2 committee hearings and really gotten vetted, and it was about a $700,000 cut or reduction in revenue to the state. The proposal on the breastfeeding equipment, which, by the way, I did support adding that to it, and it's about $1.7 million. But it hasn't been discussed in any depth. So this is I won't say an emotional, but it hasn't been as thoroughly vetted. So I suppose that it will be in the future, even though it wasn't incorporated this time. I think that bill will come back. And as a member of the Indiana Commission on Women, this is something that we move forward as a concern of women in Indiana. So we want to make sure that it has full vetting and full support before it is incorporated, although I tried to support it this time. Concerns on environment and coal. I'm not part of that utilities, and I don't think I want to sit through those committee hearings for the hours on end, but here are some of the things that come to mind to maybe an average person is if you have, okay, we did establish a task force, an energy task force, to look at how the reduction in coal and the increase in alternative fuels and how they're becoming more popular and cheaper to provide, until, one moves up as the other's moving down, we have a bit of a gap. And how are we going to address that gap if these coal companies decide, I'm going to invest all my money in the new technologies, I'm going to shut down my coal plants, I'm going to be there at full capacity in 5 years or whatever, but in the meantime, you're not going to be supplying coal. What are we going to do to fill that gap? This bill, as I understand it, was a short-term bill, and it does sunset. So it's just they can't shut down during this period until they know what's going to be moving in to fill its space. One of the big dangers is if you shut down, if what we have like 4 companies that are providing a lot of this, if 3 of them shut down, then the last guy standing has a monopoly. And we don't want those rates to affect our Hoosiers either. So there's a give and take there as we move forward with our energy policy. A couple of bills that I have introduced, you come into the General Assembly with some sense of, I have knowledge in certain areas, and you want to introduce legislation in those areas. Over the last 7 years, I've unexpectedly sort of fallen into this public safety area, which I never anticipated. Police officers, other law enforcement, firefighters, and even nurses. So, and it's really through the groups down here that I've gotten a lot of information about nursing and advanced practice nurses. There's an organization here called CAPNY. It's pretty active in Monroe County. And they've taken the time, and we've had coffee once or twice a year, and they've brought me up to date on what their industry needs and what their concerns are. And so I've had an opportunity to learn about how they provide medical services in a deeper way. When you go into your doctor's office, you might see the doctor, you might see their physician's assistant, or you might see their advanced practice nurse. Maybe it doesn't matter to you, but the nurses, the APRNs, have limited authority. And last year, we had a big bill about expanding their scope of authority. It did not get called down for a third reading. I think if it did, if it passed or failed, it was going to be on a 1 or 2 vote margin. And when you're that close, that really means that your legislation needs some more work to get more people on board or take out more of what people are against. So it just needed more work. But there were 2 aspects in that bill. One of them was my amendment about, on the state nursing board, they're the, what do you want to call it? Not the licensing authority, but the, when you do something wrong. Disciplinary board, thank you. And advanced practice nurses are the highest level of nursing that you can get, and there are no APRNs on the board. So if you're the disciplinary board, how can you accurately or effectively discipline one of your coworkers if you've not reached that level of education and training? So it passed on a voice vote last year that APRNs there have to be at least 2. At least one of them has to have prescriptive authority on the Indiana State Nursing Board. So that passed last year. I wrote the bill this year. We're running out of time, so my bill is being amended on Monday into Representative Schmaltz's bill, which would also give APRNs the authority to sign death certificates, because many, many times the doctor has to sign the certificate, but he never saw the patient. The APRN always did. So we're trying to advance that, that bill. The other one is regarding school resource officers. That passed unanimously out of the House. Most people don't know that not all school resource officers are law enforcement. They might be retired law enforcement, they might be private security guards. But if in the rare instance, and I don't think this has happened yet in the state of Indiana, and I hope my bill is never, ever, ever used, but if in the instance an SRO is killed in the line of duty for whatever reason, it could be a fight at a football game, it could be run over in the parking lot, it could be an active shooter, or it could be, a tornado coming through and they're gathering in the gymnasium and the wall falls, and for whatever reason, that they are entitled to the same line of duty death benefit as any other law enforcement officer would be. And I think that's $150,000. Like I said, I hope it is never used, but we wanted to make sure that they didn't fall through the cracks. The last one was it was actually firefighters brought it to me, but it has a slight environmental tone to it. It's about limiting the use of PFAS foam in firefighting. PFAS is coming under a lot of scrutiny. It is not banned yet. They're doing studies, but it is the only effective foam for fuel fires or chemical fires to put them out. So this would limit their use. Not in training. They wouldn't be allowed to use it in training unless they could contain it. They could only use it in the emergency situation. So that is coming up on second reading on Monday. But the last bill got bumped again, trying to address fire territories, initiated because of the the situation that was in the northern Monroe County. That has resolved itself. This is not aimed at that, but statewide they're looking more and more toward fire territories. So I'm trying to put on the agreements that have to be made prior to forming a territory. So there's no fighting over who gets the assets if they should dissolve.
Okay, thank you. Now we're ready for questions from the audience. Please go to the microphone, state your name, and ask your 1-minute question. One thing I would ask you to do is please listen to the questions as they're posed so that we avoid repetition. Thanks.
Good morning. My name is James Allison. Well, here we are again. Until very recently, there were some very welcome proposals about redistricting reform lurking about in the halls of the legislature, as usual, but their prospects again seemed quite dismal. And sure enough, those welcome proposals finally melted away into thin air. And I would like you, anyone on the panel, to comment on this history and perhaps foretell the future. And by the way, I would invite everyone here, and then the public in general, in fact, to a gathering of local citizens to discuss these matters in less haste on February 2nd, 3 p.m. at the county library, well before Super Bowl kickoff time.
Representative Ellington, would you like to respond?
I don't see anything in the House or the Senate that deals with redistricting, moving the session. We've had this discussion here in Bloomington, I think about every session. It comes up as an issue. And I've reached out to some of our community leaders here locally, and I said, you know, it'd be a good thing that if it's an important thing for my district, to help us and show us at a local level, because they have the option to have a committee or commission to do the city council maps for city council people. They have the options to do county commissioners maps, the county council maps. The breakout here in Monroe County is probably roughly about 40+% Republicans, but yet we only have one Republican on the county council, and the city breaks out probably 35 to 38% Republican, and there's not one Republican on the city council. So I think that would be a good test to really come up with something here locally, because throughout the state, there's 80-some% of the local and public officials are Republican, but there are about 4 to 5 communities that are more Democrat in numbers. So the rest of the state, 92 counties, looks at those other 4 or 5 and says, why should that 4 or 5 county mass control the other 80-some counties? And so that's the hard thing to work out. Who is actually going to be on the commission? Those commissions, they may be 3-2, 3-3, but at some point, someone's going to have to make that tie break. And I've never seen a commission set up that way, especially dealing with political issues, that's balanced and fair. Somebody is going to always have the edge. So I think it's something we'll talk about every session, and I think if we can work something together that would help small communities be able to opt into that, I believe they have that authority now. I think you could probably move small footsteps at a time. Thank you.
I have a comment on that. I think Representative Ellington points out a good point that gerrymandering, which is parties that are creating districts to benefit themselves, isn't just a Republican issue, it's also a Democratic issue across the state and across the country. And really, when Democrats had control of the legislature in the past, they gerrymandered the districts. I find it very difficult to look at legislators who want to rig the system. And in my opinion, we should be running on our merits. We should not be having districts that are created just to keep us in office. And that's, I think, what's happened at the state level. So if you want to look at, for instance, what is the makeup of Indiana, we've elected Democratic U.S. senators. We've elected Democratic statewide officials. We've elected Democratic governors. So that will tell you right there that it's not 80% Republican, 20% Democrat. I mean, it's not far off a split. You know, maybe it's 45% Democrat, 55 Republican, but that's not reflected in the supermajorities, Republican supermajorities in the House and Senate. Why not, just to protect both sides and protect the public, why not have a nonpartisan redistricting committee, one that either it's appointees. I think I've heard the complaint before, well, how do you get nonpartisan? Everybody's partisan in one way or another. But you just have to make sure that the representation on that commission is balanced so that you can make sure that, and then you have some parameters about what information can be used to set up districts, like communities of interest. So Bloomington, for instance, your representatives would kind of be more focused around Bloomington with our size. Right now, there are, and you can look at the makeup of this forum here, you have some representatives that go to the Illinois line. And that's kind of the way it is up north. I have in the Senate, there are senators who have 7 counties in their district. They have, it's like a congressional district. They'll have to drive 2 hours just to get across their district. And they don't like it, but they're not gonna, they're not gonna talk about it publicly in relation to a redistricting commission. So I'm co-author on a redistricting bill in the Senate, but also the kind of the backstop is a transparency in redistricting bill. I haven't heard that that's been successful either, but basically that just says whatever you use to set up these districts, you have to be able to describe why you use that information to create that district. So at least, even if we can't get a nonpartisan or balanced commission, if you can just show how these districts are set up. The last time that the Indiana redistricted, it was basically, they sent it off to a firm in DC, you put a supercomputer on analyzing what the demographics would be throughout that 10-year period and into the future so that they could their gerrymander could be maintained into the future. As was pointed out, I think I spoke to Tommy Allison on the way in, and as she said, well, those districts are created by voter rolls. So you have to be a registered voter, and those registered voters, that's who was a registered voter 10 years ago. But I think also the supercomputers can kind of come up with, extrapolate what's going to happen with movement of people. So it's a difficult situation. I think it's one of the biggest problems facing our country today is gerrymandered districts and campaign finance. And until we get those two issues under control, we're going to continue to see some really horrendous outcomes in our election.
Do we have any other comments?
When I was clerk, I think Casey Kaufman indicated she thinks I'm the only clerk who has ever actually done redistricting, not on a state level, but within the county where I was clerk. And it's not easy. When you are, your building block is a census block that nobody knows exactly how they come up with those, but that's your puzzle piece that you have to work with. I think that the cynic in me has learned that, yeah, there really is no such thing as a nonpartisan board when the appointments come from a partisan unit. So there's always that bend of which way are they going to lean, and who's going to break the tie, and how is that person appointed. So those are concerns, and they're legitimate concerns. When you look at the statutory requirements of population, communities of interest, existing boundaries, those are pretty clear cut. And if that's all you're working with, that's pretty good to work with. But then you add in the case law that starts talking about what results in what they call packing and cracking, ethnicity, income, and so forth. That complicates what isn't addressed in statute. If you were just to take, the areas and the population, the numbers without faces, without backgrounds, until that's what makes it very difficult to support a lot of the proposals that have come forth. Is it automatically takes into account this packing and cracking issue that, in my mind, that information shouldn't even be presented. Just like these supercomputers, they consider that in the growth, and I don't know that is a fair and accurate way to draw a district.
I don't know what else I can say about this issue. We've talked about it at practically every meeting for the last 10 years or something, and we're just getting no traction. Let me just say, I think you can look to Iowa and other places that have other ways of drawing the maps that don't leave them wholly in control of the people who would have to run under them. And I think they do get a better result. And I think they've figured out ways to solve these issues that get raised. And so I wish we would do it, but it's just a fact of life that if you have a system that benefits you politically and ensures you can remain in power and you get to be the committee chair and choose which bills pass and which don't, you're not going to give that up, really, no matter which party you are, unless the public really demands it. So I think this is, it's funny, we just had the celebration of 100 years from women's suffrage, right? And I'm thinking okay, how do completely powerless women manage to get the men to finally give them a right to vote? Well, they just kept pounding away at it for like 50 years, maybe longer, and they finally, broke through. And I think that's what's going to happen with redistricting. It's just going to have to be relentless, and eventually, like the civil rights movement or something, the public's going to have to get so engaged and demand things that you can actually kind of overcome the people with the power who want to hang on to it.
Thank you. It was longer than 50 years, and I hope to see you all on February 2nd.
Next question, please.
Good morning. Thanks for being here. My name is Pamela Davidson. Sorry, I have a retainer. That's why it sounds like this. I want to ask why the state of Indiana, the supermajority GOP, allow Attorney General Curtis Hill to use finite tax dollars to engage in every national lawsuit he can think of, whether it's to compromise abortion rights or impede coal cleanup or to suppress voting rights, abortion rights, whatever it is. It's particularly galling because this man may lose his legal license for some egregious behavior. So I want to ask why the supermajority GOP allows this man to use our dollars in this way, which are boldly political partisan activities, thinking about his future election. It's very upsetting.
Would you like to address this?
That supermajority, so I guess I can ask. He is a separately elected position, elected by the Hoosiers across the state, and received the highest vote ever. So that really is up to the people. The accusations, if they are proven, he deserves every disciplinary measure that he gets at this point that hasn't been done.
Let me just address that, because I am frustrated that our Attorney General in our name is suing to try to kill off health care for all kinds of Hoosiers. And the thing that's frustrating for someone in the system, and it really should upset other people in the system, is that the legislature gets elected to make policy, the governor is elected to make policy, the Attorney General is elected to be the lawyer. He is not elected to be a policymaking position. Now, in fairness to the Republicans of the state of Indiana, I will say that this issue exists across the country. Every Attorney General, whether they're Democrat or Republican, they pursue their political agendas and enter in these lawsuits. And I do think it's problematic because I was talking to somebody about this, and they said, the Attorney General is supposed to be the lawyer for the state and in these matters that come up. And so the question is, when the Attorney General on his own decides to join a lawsuit, who is his client? Who hired him to do that? It wasn't the legislature, it wasn't the governor. And so I think the role that Attorney Generals play across the country is problematic. And if I'm going to criticize Curtis Hill for doing lawsuits, which I think are horrible, then I have to admit that probably next door in Illinois, you've got the Attorney General on the other side of it. And it really ought not work that way. They should have to be empowered to enter these lawsuits by the legislature or some external publicly elected group of some type. And I don't know when we're going to get there, but it is frustrating because it's just completely up to Curtis Hill as to what he wants to join on to. And I'd have to go back and look at his platform when he ran, but I don't remember him running on the attempting to take health care away from everybody. I don't remember that being the issue.
Thank you. Any other comments?
One thing, what you have to understand too is a lot of times, no matter what office you're in, there is staff that's there that really does 95+% of the job. Whether it's Secretary of State's office or whether it's the mayor's office here locally. There's staff that's been there for years. They know how to do their job. The only issue would be probably is what he chooses by statute. He's allowed to do that. He's basically the state's lawyer for anything we get sued in, and he has to defend us. They choose, as Matt says, different issues to defend. But I would say my district, Southwest Indiana, where I go from here to Linton to Lagodi and Shoals, I would say agrees with the issues he's been taking on. At least that's what I've been hearing from my constituents. But he has the authority, and as all the other states also. But I will say that one issue the Attorney General's nationwide is helping us on, and they've put their heads together. We've been working on legislation talking about attorney generals for robocalls and telemarketer calls and what they call stir and shaken technology for mask caller ID. So if you get a lot of calls that they're not the true numbers they're calling from, the AG's offices across the state, across the nation, are working together to help stop this. And they've taken some input on one of my bills. So I will say some of the AGs have been really good with those issues.
Thank you. Senator Stoops?
Yes. And you're right that these lawsuits are expensive. For instance, I think Representative Pierce brought up every year he's been in the legislature, we've talked about gerrymandering and redistricting. I would say every year that I've been in the legislature, the state of Indiana has had to defend itself against unconstitutional reproductive rights bills, so anti-abortion bills. And they're patently unconstitutional, but they still get passed by the legislature, and then our Attorney General defends them to the tune of $1 million a year, just for those bills. And if we think about, okay, we have an opportunity to help nursing mothers across the state that's going to be $1 million plus, and then we're spending that money. And we're saying we don't have it, but we're spending it on these lawsuits. Attorney General can look at that and say this is unconstitutional. There's no way it's going to be successful no matter what the legislature passed. And again this year, just in the Senate, we have a bill that says if a woman takes abortion medication, which is a couple of pills, you take them over a period of days, that when they get the pills, they're going to get some vial that they have to catch the remains in, bring it back to the abortion provider, and then arrange burial. Now, it's so it boggles my mind. This is just the tip of the iceberg. There's more. But as an example, that'll get passed because many Republican legislators, there's that base for their primary voters that are very much single issue, and that's their issue. And they feel it's necessary to make that statement, so they'll pass it. But it's very expensive, and we lose, rightfully. Just to me, we do have to have a serious look at this, and we have to really look at how much these are costing. So they do have staff, but there are a lot of other expenses that are associated with it. And we've analyzed the expenses, say, for reproductive rights issues, and it's about $1 million a year.
Just one more thing to add. The Attorney General is a statewide elected office. We can always change it to an appointed office, and then it becomes part of the governor's platform about who he might appoint to that. But so far, that proposal has fallen flat.
Thank you.
He would even like to prosecute marijuana possession cases in Marion County. He's decided that's his job too. Crazy.
Our next question, please.
Good morning. Thanks for being here. I really appreciate the effort that you guys make to show up and do this with us. My name is Georgianne Catalona, and I live here in Bloomington. And I wanted to talk about SB 342, which is the Pregnancy and Childbirth Discrimination Bill. It's the one that does pregnancy workplace accommodations. I have been following this bill for 3 years. And the issue and the manifestation of it at the State House. And it looks like it's going to go this time. It looks like it's going to pass, and I'm super excited. And I actually, for the first time coming here, I actually feel kind of emotional standing up with you guys. I've been coming to these for a while. This bill matters so much to me, and it matters so much to families in the area across the state. 3 out of 4 Hoosier women are in the workforce. Many, many, many hundreds of them thousands of them are going to be pregnant while they are working. We need this to stay a strong bill. What it sets out reasonable accommodations that most of them will not cost employers a dime, providing a stool for a cashier, shifting someone who has to work in a warehouse and lift heavy things. That's really important. And as it crosses to the other chamber, it's in the Senate. The hearing is on Monday. It's going to go to the floor vote in the Senate. I'm really hoping that it doesn't get amended and watered down. And when it crosses to the House, I really hope that you all will support it and keep it a strong bill. Thank you.
Anyone like to comment?
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Our next question.
Hi, Cynthia Bredheim, and echoing Georgianne's comment, thank you for being here. In April, I attended a Chamber of Commerce and Community Foundation-sponsored event at the Ivy Tech on quality of life, and they released the results of a regional survey that showed businesses stay away from locating in Indiana because of the perceived notion of racism. There were 2 things that prevented businesses from locating here. One of them was racism. The other one was affordable housing. I'm wondering what the Senate or House can do to come out and denounce white nationalism or white supremacy, since many people consider those a philosophy, not so much a philosophy as an indictment incentivizing violence, whether it's preventing people from getting jobs or getting homes. And if it's holding back our businesses, how can we help?
Thank you.
And jump in there and say, you're absolutely right. I mean, oftentimes the people making decisions about whether to locate corporate headquarters here or parts of their business or to invest in things here, a lot of that money is from the coast, right? It's New York City or Silicon Valley or someplace, and when they don't know much about Indiana other than we have a 500-mile racetrack and we love basketball. Beyond that, unfortunately, the legislature in the past decade, we haven't helped ourselves a whole lot. We've had some controversies and some things that have gotten, in some cases, world news attention, and it's not made us look like we're a very open state. So the first thing we could do is just try to avoid making the problem worse. And it's really a long-standing thing if you think about it. I mean, the Ku Klux Klan was so big here in the 20s. That's kind of a part of our history. There have been movies about, that era and things. And so people tend to hear about that. And so I would agree that we're kind of at a point where the economic development, and I think that the governor and some Republican leaders recognize this at a level, is they've kind of cut taxes about as much as they can. The regulations have been reduced about as much as they can. I'm sure someone will find something they don't like, but I mean, essentially these classic business climate things, infrastructure, all that kind of stuff, I mean, there's not a whole lot more to be done in those areas necessarily. So what it comes down to is this thing called quality of life or quality of place. And so that's when people, and I remember going to a medical device association meeting, and there was a woman there who was an executive from one of the medical device companies in Indianapolis, and she had been here 2 or 3 years from Boston, and she talked about getting offered this job in Indiana and telling her kids and her husband, I have this great opportunity in Indiana, and they're like, oh no, not Indiana. And they're practically crying that they would have to move from Boston to Indiana. And she said, once they got here, they figured out that Indianapolis actually had some art and culture. They didn't think any existed in the state, right? So things that 15 or 20 years ago, whether it's a hiking trail or supporting the symphony orchestra, things like that were seen like to be these just kind of weird frills that, are not very important, I think they're critical now. And I think that the governor and even Governor Pence had, I forget what he called it, but he had this fund where he kind of doled out money to different regions of the state. And they're doing things like rehabbing old movie theaters and doing things like that, there was one point where the legislature would have kind of said that stuff's not important. So I think we're getting there, but to me the most important thing is just don't make it worse.
Someone else like to comment?
I'd just like to say that I think the facts are a little different than probably public opinion. We've got residents, especially moving in from Illinois to Indiana. Last count was like 200 and some thousand. We've got major investment in Northwest Indiana, which will make it a lot easier for citizens to live in Indiana. If they still want to work in Chicago area, they can. You're going to see a lot of growth in that sector of Indiana. Crane Naval Weapons is going to be hiring for the next 10 years up to 500 employees each year. They are looking for housing. Most of them live in like Bloomington or Terre Haute or Vincennes. Recently, like in 2017, Indiana was ranked #1 in the nation for transparency in our tax codes and our laws. We were ranked #7 in the nation for growth. I think we are generally on the top 10 of other states as the envy of bringing more business here. We just had a plant expansion announced, a $400 million investment. That's happening all over Indiana. The factory jobs are coming back. The economy, everyone's investments are doing great here in Indiana. Pensions are being fully funded. They've been shored up where other states, they might have higher wages, but they got a higher cost of living, and their pensions are so under, I don't know how they're going to make it to bring back something where they don't file bankruptcy. So I think Indiana is envy, and I think our national economy is really helping. And I'm here to make sure that my district has those opportunities in all aspects, and we do not stand for discrimination. So we thank you for your advice and your comments. So thanks.
Thank you. Any other comments?
I don't actually know where a lot of those statistics came from, because Indiana is not growing. We may be stable, but a lot of that is based on births compared to deaths. We lag far behind on job growth, and in Indiana, people are paid 26% less than the national average in neighboring states. So we're we're not successfully pulling in those industries that are paying more. I always liken it to trying to improve your economy by turning Indiana into a third world country. That's what it feels like to me when these bills are moving through. You're cutting regulation, you're cutting taxes, so no longer do wealthy people and corporations contribute to the tax base for those living amenities. And the middle class workers are left footing the bill, and then they're making less. But I have an advertising background, and I think anybody would tell you that if you've destroyed your reputation, which I think Indiana has with different bills, we can't even get anti-discrimination language in our bills. Kind of the homophobic, misogynist policies. We still have the battle of making sure that transgender individuals can't use restrooms, and it does get national and international coverage. The only way to combat that is everybody's got to be all in and saying that's not what we do anymore. Indiana is open to everybody. We invite everybody to the state of Indiana. We don't discriminate, but that would take unanimous vote of the legislature. So the other problem we have in the state of Indiana with attracting businesses is infrastructure. So our infrastructure, because of tax caps, many local communities can't add to their amenities. For instance, they can't invest in parks. They can't even pave roads now, so they're turning paved roads to gravel. Transportation, you talk about affordable housing, and we've talked about affordable housing. You need to be able to get workers from where they live to the job, and that requires public transit. So again, I have a bill dealing with that, and I think people recognize that it's an economic development issue. I think Indiana has a long way to go. Unfortunately, we've done a lot of damage to our reputation, and it's going to be a long time before we can get that fixed.
Thank you.
I think the 2 points you bring up, the affordable housing is really, really serious. And we can't even really agree on what's the cost of workforce housing. Is it the $120,000 to $175,000 home, or is it, as some people say, the $160,000 to $225,000? And I can see a lot of people just saying automatically, "I'll never own a house that's $225,000." I have two sons in their 20s who are lucky enough to have been able to enter the housing market. And it's very concerning because even some local units of government have come and said, for every house in that price range that is built within our boundaries, we are losing money because of the services we provide. So there's a very controversial bill coming up this week in the House. It's House Bill 1060. It sort of addresses the similar item that was talked about last year that only passed by, one of those 3-vote margins, and then I think it was killed in the Senate or not called down in the Senate. So how much regulation should the state be doing to make sure that home building can take place versus how much should the free market help promote? And that is a big question, but I think that is going to be the greater concern is additional housing within the affordable range.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Our next question.
Good morning. My name is Greg Knott. We have the highest healthcare costs in the country, and Ball State professor Michael Hicks has found the reason for this isn't that we are so much more unhealthy than people in other states. It's because our government has allowed more hospital consolidation, anti-competitive practices, and monopoly power for the so-called not-for-profit hospital industry. Their supernormal profits are as much as 48%, compared to 3 to 4% for Walmart. Each of us pays over $800 per year more to fund these excess monopoly profits that are 12 times the Indiana Rainy Day Surplus Fund. What are you doing to solve this problem by breaking up the monopolies and promoting competition to bring down our cost?
Okay. Who would like to address
Greg, thanks for the question. I can't say that, I am specifically working on any identifiable, specifically spelled out solution. There are a lot of concerns, not only about what came out in that study, but then the other side also says there are concerns with how that study was done. Those are all the things that we have to take into consideration. One of those nonprofits is sitting on $2 billion of profit, but they don't call it profit. They call it something like unused assets, that they will be future reinvestments, some term like that. So they're not actually calling it profit. That is the new focus of the legislature, is how much can we get involved without getting into rate setting and some other areas that legislature shouldn't be involved in. So although I can't give you an exact answer on the plan is being formed.
And I talked about some bills earlier to increase transparency, but that's the tip of the iceberg. How can we have a look at what these different hospitals are doing and what they're charging and how are they making that money? The biggest problem that I've seen in this state, and I'm sure this is nationwide, is the consolidation. So not only are these hospitals consolidating, they're becoming the insurance agency or the insurance provider. They're becoming the pharmacy and the pharmaceutical provider. And when they have those monopolies, they can ratchet up their profit. And like I'll give you an example of what that not-for-profit shell looks like, say with charter schools. So in the state of Indiana, we have these virtual charters. They call themselves not-for-profits, but obviously they were operated by a for-profit management company, which was the same operation as the not-for-profit. And so all the profit went to the management company for management, right? So there was no profit. And they were basically incentivized to do as little as they could towards education. The hospitals, again, are the same way. So they're not for profit, but look at all these different contracts and methods they have, the charges, and look at where that money goes. And you'll see that not for profit is just really it's way too loose. And I think it's perfectly appropriate for the legislature to put some serious controls on that. But for healthcare as a whole in the state and the nation, this is something that people have to be aware of. They're preparing for maybe a Medicare for all, because they know that Medicare for all just means that the private provider gets paid. If the provider owns all the doctors, if they own all the pharmacies, if they own the hospitals, they're going to submit that same bill to the federal government that you get now. So it's a serious concern.
Representative Ellington, did you have a comment?
Yes. I talked earlier in my opening statement about the percentages of costs that are above the Medicaid set standards. Indiana's hospitals was 300 and some % above. While that average out of that 25 state study, that was about plus or minus 4%, and we were number one in that expense. We have 1,004, which is by Representative Smaltz. We'll stop surprise billing. It's going to work on going to a facility where you're in network, but all of a sudden you get a surprise with an out-of-network bill from another provider that you wasn't aware of. So if you have a scheduled operation or a scheduled procedure, we're trying to get that. It's out of committee, and it'll be going to the House floor, I think maybe next week at some point, early during the week. Also 1005, which talks about the transparency of just that whole encompassing pricing structure statewide, and so that came out of committee, and it'll be to the House floor. But personally, I can tell you, my father-in-law, Dr. Habby here in Bloomington, was a urologist. He's retired. But I've heard stories from him for the last 30-plus years about physicians would want to bring in a new procedure or a new machine to provide services that the hospital didn't have. And then they would get in arguments and legal battles with whatever hospital it was that would threaten them because they're bringing something new that maybe the hospital wanted to get into to make more profit with, and basically strong-arm them that if you did not, if you bring this in you will lose your hospital privileges. And I just don't think that's right. If someone wants to make the investment up early for a procedure or a type of machine that would help, I think we have not only a state problem, but a national problem. I don't sit on the health committee, but I think that's probably the committee to be on right now to really save citizens' dollars. Thank you for your question.
Representative Pierce?
Yeah, that study got quite a bit of attention. Of course, the hospitals do dispute it. I think they put out kind of a counter study claiming that it's not what Professor Hicks portrayed. I do think that all across the economy, there are problems with antitrust laws really not being enforced the way they once were. I think about sometime in the 80s, the kind of philosophy of antitrust shifted, and it's now been skewed toward these larger consolidated companies. And the thing that makes it a little bit difficult in the hospital area is there's still a lot of cost shifting that goes on because there are a lot of people that still show up in the emergency room that aren't covered or have limited coverage. And so they have to kind of absorb the cost of that. And so they kind of, basically the rest of us pay for it through higher charges. So one thing we could do is just straighten out our healthcare system finally, and maybe be more transparent and straightforward. And we wouldn't have all this cost shifting because people would actually have insurance. That's the first thing. But I do think the consolidation is difficult. I mean, I'll just be frank. I'll probably get in trouble for saying this, but I think our own hospital and the big conglomerate that now belongs to, the quality's gone down. Now, maybe not the actual delivery of healthcare quality, but can you get the phone answered? Can you get the bill actually done correctly? I mean, there's so many billing problems that I just know my family, we've been on the phone all the time with those people. It's like, why are you sending this bill? Do the right code, the whole thing. And so I think that when you become the predominant provider in an area and you have no alternative, that allows that predominant provider to kind of slack off when it comes to delivery of the basic services. And so that is a problem. But I think that honestly, legislators are probably going to have to learn a whole lot more about this very complicated sector of the economy to figure out exactly what we need to do to fix it. And of course, the federal government, we would like for someday to kind of figure out what it wants to do. I mean, we currently are in a mode where the federal government is just all about trying to deconstruct the Affordable Care Act. Now we'll have an election in a year, maybe we'll have a different federal government, and maybe they'll go back to figure out how to make the Affordable Care Act more affordable or move on to the next thing. But we need some help from the federal government on this stuff too.
Okay, thank you.
Real quickly, could I just get a show of hands on who supports leveling
I'm
the
sorry,
playing
sir.
field for-
We have to let the next question come up, so you'll need to wait if you have another question.
All right, thank you.
Uh-huh.
Thank you. I'm Bruce Jaffe, and I heard comments about consolidation and transparency. And one area that we've had a lot of consolidation in this state is in the media, especially newspapers. Yet we want a transparent state legislature and your actions. You all have a decent amount of longevity. How has that changed during your years in terms of media coverage?
Oh yeah, I can tell you all about this because I had the advantage of having been on the staff for 10 years. So my kind of institutional memory, with the exception of maybe 3 or 4 years, starts in December of 1989 until now. And I can tell you that when I walked in that building as a staffer and the legislature is in session, you would look at the area where the media people sit and you would see people every bit as veteran as the legislators. You'd see a Pat Traub from the Indianapolis Star. You'd see a Mary Dieter from the Louisville Courier-Journal, and they had been there session after session. And they remembered what you said 5 years ago about something. And so if you suddenly changed your tune, they'd say, oh, well, didn't you have a different position before? Why is it different now? And they also understood the legislative process enough that they did more than just report on what somebody said in a committee hearing. They would understand the backroom maneuvering that's going on, or maybe the motivations that aren't being articulated to the public, and they could kind of get into that. And every paper, even our own local paper, at least a few times a session, would send a reporter up there. When there were issues that were important, you'd have Kurt Vanderdusen up there on the scene reporting on it. And that just doesn't happen now. And it's just, it is a problem. I mean, I kind of laughed to myself because Jeff and I had a very spirited disagreement about his fire territory bill, which went on for months in the session, and we were like at it like crazy, you know, fighting over this bill, and there was not a single word in the local paper about that whole thing. I think until maybe the very end, they finally did a story about it, and I thought that was just very curious, and I thought to myself, well, gee, is it my job now to be the junior reporter for the newspaper and call them up every day? It's like, hey, you're missing a big story up here, and you might want to look at it, but I don't know how it's going to change or whether it'll get better. We're in a weird transition period, and I hope we're not in a death spiral, but it seems to me like we are. I mean, this latest hedge fund group that owns our local paper, I mean, if you pay attention, you see little things like, I noticed that the last away game that IU had, there was no Bloomington sports reporter reporting on that. They just took the Indianapolis Star reporter story. And I could see if your hedge funds are all about reducing overhead, because they know they can't really increase the revenues, particularly in industry like newspapers. So if you can lower your cost of operation, that's where you squeeze out your profit. So that means get rid of your printing press in Bloomington, move it to Indy. Don't have any copy editors in Bloomington. Send this stuff off to some far off land to be copy edited. And maybe you don't send your sports reporters to away games anymore. You just let somebody from your other paper. So you obviously got me going on a long diatribe. I could go on forever and ever analyzing the Herald Times and how it's kind of decaying. But
Go, Matt, go.
It's a but you have totally hit it, and there have been studies that done that show whether it's local government or state government, if you have robust reporting so people can understand what's happening, you get better government. It's when I and others can kind of operate in the shadows because people aren't really knowing what's going on up there that we can do all kinds of crazy stuff and get away with it. So I think the media is very important, and it's sad what's happening now.
So we are getting worse government, is that what you're saying?
I think we probably are.
So thank you for that comment. So I just called Ernest Young earlier this week, Friday evening, about one of my bills that's going to be in committee. We had it in committee Wednesday. It got held for another meeting Monday. To me, it may not be the most important bill in the state, but we've got a couple of really large lobbyists that do not want to adopt my language, and it deals with these numbers that are spoofed or spammed. When people call you, you may think it's your neighbor or your doctor. They reach out and grab even working people's telephone numbers. And I get calls on mine like, you just called me, who are you? And I look at my phone, I'm thinking, it wasn't me. And for the first few times I kept thinking, maybe I'm butt dialing somebody. But then after the third or fourth one, I thought, no, this is unique, this is wrong. So my bill, I need to get to the press to get out between now and Monday to statewide legislators that if my bill does not get passed, the federal regulations that just got voted in the bill in December does not give Indiana or any other state the enforcement powers to go after those spoofed calls and to make sure that our large telecommunication companies install this software. It gives our AG no teeth. And I'm having a hard time getting this out to all the media because, you know, they may do a story on Friday, but that's usually for a Sunday, Monday paper. You know, the instant, now we may get one tomorrow for today, but they've got somebody on staff doing that. But for something that would pop up as important as this, to get a bill passed, there's nobody in the offices to do a story. And this is not here in Bloomington, this is generally statewide. And so yes, it has a negative impact upon policy. So thank you, I think that's a big issue.
Any other comments?
I'm not sure we have the chicken or the egg. The level of professionalism amongst journalists. There are several around the State House, and there are fewer now. You say I have a long time. It's not that long, it seems. But, you know, you knew that if Jim Shella asked for an interview, he was going to be tough. but he was going to be fair. So whether or not you agreed with him, you knew that it was going to be a fair treatment. Same with Brandon Smith, same with several others. That's not always the case anymore. So I don't mind a tough interview, but I hate a clearly biased interview. The other thing that since the Herald Times has moved their presses out of the county, is that right? That's what I read? There is a statute that says, unless it's changed recently, that if it is not printed in the county, that all of your public notifications don't have to be printed in this paper. They can choose any paper that's circulated in this county. So your county budget could be printed in the Indianapolis Star as long as the Indianapolis Star is distributed in Monroe County. So I think that there are some little tweaks there that maybe they didn't realize when they made that move that could actually contribute to a downward spiral, because now all of these required publications are not required to be in their paper.
Are there any other comments? We'll take one more comment, and then we're going to get ready to close.
Just briefly, and I agree that there's been a real reduction in press coverage. If you look in the basement of the State House, where all the different news media had their offices, it's a ghost town. But when we do get coverage, it makes a big difference. For instance, the payday lending issue that came up, the only reason that got stopped were payday lenders were going to be able to charge hundreds of percents for these loans. The only reason it got stopped is because it got coverage. And I can count that on two hands, where there's an issue moving, there's no public attention, but when there was finally press coverage, it changed the whole ballgame. And so press coverage is important, and it really affects what happens in the legislature, just making sure that the public know. And without that press coverage, then there are bills that are getting passed that nobody knows about. So, or at least they don't hear about them until it affects them.
Thank you. Sorry, we're not able to address all questions. However, we have gone past our 11 o'clock mark, so we would like to conclude today's legislative update. Our next update will be Saturday, February 15th. It'll be here in the City Council chambers. A couple of reminders. One is you can follow the work of the Indiana General Assembly on their website, which is iga.in.gov, which provides a wealth of information. It's an excellent website, and it allows you to track the progress of individual bills. And you can also follow their work through the Bloomington Herald Times and other local media, as we just discussed. In closing, I would like to thank Ralph Shaw, who made the arrangements for this program, and also to the folks who assisted us this morning. I'd like to thank the Public Works Office of the City of Bloomington for the use of this room for today's program, and of course to CATS for recording this legislative update. Be sure to check the CATS schedule when the recording of this update will be available. And finally, thanks to our area legislators for being here to share current legislative session information with us, and thanks to you all for attending.